He was a man who was terrified of death, a man who was haunted by the fear of dying young, a man who was so afraid of guns that he would not even touch a toy pistol, a man who was plagued with doubts and insecurities, a man who was often paralyzed by anxiety and depression. Now imagine that this same man, at the age of 34, would stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., before a crowd of more than 250,000 people and deliver a speech that would echo through the ages, a speech that would become the most famous oration in American history, a speech that would galvanize a nation and change the course of the civil rights movement. He would tell the world about his dream, a dream that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He would become the moral compass of a nation, a man who would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 35, a man who would be assassinated at the age of 39, a man whose legacy would inspire generations to come. This is the story of Martin Luther King, Jr., a man who was not born a leader, but who was forged into one by the crucible of the struggle for racial justice. But here is what most people do not realize about Martin Luther King, Jr., the man who is remembered as the symbol of the civil rights movement, the man who preached the power of nonviolence, was a man who was deeply conflicted, a man who struggled with his own doubts, a man who was often criticized by his own allies, a man who was under constant surveillance by the FBI, a man who was threatened, beaten, and harassed, a man who was deeply human, and a man who was always searching, always questioning, always striving to live up to the ideals he preached. To understand Martin Luther King, Jr., you have to go back to the beginning, to the bustling streets of Atlanta, Georgia, where he was born on January 15, 1929, into a world of racial segregation, a world where the color of your skin determined your opportunities, your dignity, and your very humanity. He was born into a family of privilege, the son of a prominent Baptist minister, a man who was a leader in the Black community, a man who was not afraid to speak truth to power. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a fierce advocate for civil rights, a man who was determined to build a better world for his children. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was a woman of deep faith and quiet strength, a woman who provided the emotional support and the spiritual foundation that her son would need to navigate the challenges of his life. Martin was the middle child, a boy who was deeply influenced by his parents' commitment to social justice and their unwavering faith in the power of God. He was a bright student, a boy who excelled in his studies, a boy who was deeply interested in the power of words. He was also a boy who was deeply sensitive, a boy who was deeply affected by the injustices he saw around him. He was a boy who was searching for a way to make a difference, a boy who was determined to change the world.
King was educated at Morehouse College, a historically Black college in Atlanta, where he was influenced by the teachings of the great civil rights leader and philosopher, Dr. Benjamin Mays. Mays was a man who believed that the role of the Black church was to fight for social justice, a man who believed that the pursuit of equality was a moral imperative. King was deeply influenced by Mays's commitment to social justice, and he began to develop his own ideas about the role of the church in the struggle for civil rights. He was ordained as a minister in 1947, a decision that reflected his growing commitment to the ministry and his desire to use his faith to change the world. He was a man who was beginning to find his voice, a man who was beginning to find his purpose. King was educated at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was exposed to the works of the great theologians and philosophers of the West. He was deeply influenced by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, a man who had used nonviolent resistance to challenge the British colonial rule in India. He was also influenced by the teachings of Henry David Thoreau, who had argued that individuals had a moral duty to disobey unjust laws. He was a man who was beginning to develop his own philosophy of nonviolent resistance, a philosophy that would become the foundation of the civil rights movement. He earned a doctorate in theology from Boston University in 1955, a remarkable achievement for a young man who had overcome the obstacles of segregation and discrimination. He was a man who was now Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., a man who was prepared to lead the struggle for racial justice. The turning point in his life came in December 1955, when a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. The arrest sparked a boycott of the Montgomery bus system, a boycott that would last for 381 days. King was elected as the leader of the boycott, a decision that would thrust him into the national spotlight. He was a man who was not prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, a man who was not prepared for the threats, the harassment, and the constant pressure. He was a man who was deeply afraid, a man who was plagued by doubts and insecurities. He was a man who was forced to confront his own mortality. But he was also a man who was determined to succeed, a man who was determined to make a difference. He led the boycott with courage and conviction, and his leadership transformed the civil rights movement. The boycott was a success, and it established King as the most important leader of the civil rights movement. The next decade was a period of intense political activism. King led a series of nonviolent campaigns against segregation, including the Birmingham Campaign, the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery marches. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963 was a turning point. King and his followers were met with brutal violence as the police used dogs and fire hoses to break up peaceful protests. The images of the violence were broadcast around the world, and they shocked the conscience of the nation. King was arrested and jailed, and he wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, a powerful defense of nonviolent resistance. It was a masterpiece of moral argument, a document that would become a classic of American literature. It was a letter that inspired millions of people to join the struggle for civil rights. The March on Washington in August 1963 was a defining moment. King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before a crowd of more than 250,000 people and delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It was a speech that was filled with imagery, passion, and moral clarity. He spoke of his dream of a nation where his children would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. He spoke of a nation where all people would be treated with dignity and respect. The speech was a masterpiece of oratory, a moment that captured the hopes and aspirations of a generation. It was a speech that would define his legacy. In 1964, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in the civil rights movement. He was 35 years old, the youngest person to ever receive the award. He was a man who had achieved more than most people achieve in a lifetime. He was a man who was celebrated as a hero, a man whose name was spoken with reverence around the world.
But he was also a man who was deeply conflicted. He was a man who was under constant surveillance by the FBI, a man who was threatened, beaten, and harassed, a man who was often criticized by his own allies. He was a man who was struggling to keep his family together, a man who was struggling to maintain his own sanity. King's personal life was also marked by struggle. He was a man who was deeply committed to his family, but he was also a man who was often absent, a man who was often consumed by his work. He was a man who was deeply devoted to his wife, Coretta Scott King, a woman of immense strength and intelligence, who was also a leader in the civil rights movement. She was a woman who was often overshadowed by her husband, but she was also a woman who was deeply committed to the cause of social justice. Their marriage was a partnership, a relationship that was both a source of strength and a source of conflict. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always a good husband or father, a man who was often criticized for his personal failings. In the final years of his life, King began to focus on the issue of economic justice. He believed that the struggle for civil rights was not just about ending segregation. It was about addressing the poverty and inequality that plagued Black communities. He launched the Poor People's Campaign, a movement that was designed to challenge the economic injustices that were endemic to American society. He was a man who was expanding his vision, a man who was no longer just a civil rights leader, but a human rights leader. He was a man who was fighting for the rights of all people, regardless of their race or their class. On April 4, 1968, King was assassinated by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting a strike by sanitation workers. He was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel when he was shot. He was 39 years old. His death was a moment of profound grief for the nation, a moment that shook the world. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, and he was killed by the very forces he had fought against. His death was a tragedy, but it also made him a martyr, a symbol of the struggle for civil rights.
The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most profound in American history. He is remembered as the leader of the civil rights movement, a man who changed the course of history. He is celebrated as a symbol of nonviolence, a man whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance has inspired movements for social justice around the world. He has been honored with a national holiday, a memorial in Washington, D.C., and a place in the pantheon of American heroes. He is a man who is considered one of the greatest leaders in history. But his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was not always a good husband or father, a man who was often criticized by his own followers. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the prejudices and the weaknesses of his time. Why should someone born today still care about Martin Luther King Jr.? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the importance of moral courage. He was a man who was not content to accept the world as it was, a man who dared to imagine a better world, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to make that vision a reality. He showed us that the most powerful weapon in the fight against oppression is not violence, but the courage to endure suffering without retaliation. He showed us that the pursuit of justice is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream.
He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." He was a man who believed in the power of hope, a man who believed that the world was moving in the direction of justice, even when it seemed impossible. He was a man who was not afraid to fail, a man who was not afraid to struggle, a man who was not afraid to sacrifice. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who taught us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a leader, he was a man who was a prophet, a man who was a visionary, a man whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but love. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but love. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a prophet, a man whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but love. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the victory we achieve, but the struggle we endure. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero, he was a man who was a prophet, a man whose legacy will continue to inspire generations to come.